"That's just an old Bible. Nobody reads those." He set it on top of the giveaway pile like it was nothing. A stack of old lamps and mismatched dishes. And when I asked him why my grandmother's Bible was sitting on top of a box headed for the curb, he told me, without even looking up from what he was doing, that nobody reads those old things anymore. A woman I'd never met before called me 3 weeks later, her voice breaking apart mid-sentence, and told me that Bible was the single most important piece of documentary evidence her research team had spent 4 years searching for. I want you to understand, before I tell you anything else, exactly what that moment at the curb felt like. Standing there in my own driveway looking at a giveaway pile that included something I couldn't yet fully explain the importance of. I didn't have Dr. Baptiste's research yet. I didn't know about Cassie Whitfield's actual role in founding this town, didn't know about a scholarship trust sitting unclaimed for 2 decades. I only knew, in that first disoriented moment, that something my grandmother had guarded with near-religious devotion for her entire life had been reduced, in the space of one busy Saturday afternoon, to an item my own son considered comparable to a stack of mismatched dishes. I'm 76 years old, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. This isn't a story about a book. It's a story about what gets decided is disposable by people who never once opened it to actually look. Let me back up. I live in Colby's Crossing, a small town in northern Georgia. Most people outside 3 surrounding counties have never once heard of. In the same house my grandmother Odessa built with her own husband's hands back in 1951, on land her own mother had settled 2 generations before that. I've spent my whole life here, 31 years working for the Postal Service before I retired, and I've always understood, in the vague way you understand something you've never had reason to examine closely, that my family's roots in this particular patch of ground ran deeper than most. I remember my grandmother Odessa with a clarity that surprises me sometimes, given how long ago she passed. A tall, careful woman who kept that Bible on a specific shelf in her front parlor her entire life, never once letting it be moved without her direct supervision, dusting its cover herself every single week rather than trusting anyone else with the task. I used to ask her as a boy why that particular book mattered so much more than any of the other books in her house, and she'd tell me, every time, the same careful answer. Because it remembers what other people decided wasn't worth remembering, Charles. Someday you'll understand why that matters. I didn't fully understand what she meant, not as a child, not even as a younger man managing my own family and career. I understood it, I think, only in pieces, hearing fragments of family stories at holiday gatherings, half-legends about a great-great-grandmother who'd apparently done something significant in the earliest years of this town's history, stories that had softened, over generations of retelling, into something closer to folklore than documented fact. Welcome to Brian's Revenge. If that opening's already got you curious, that's exactly where I need you. Hit that like button, tell me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because what happened over the following month is going to show you exactly how close my family came to losing a piece of history nobody realized was still sitting quietly on a bookshelf, undisturbed, for longer than either of my own children have been alive. That Bible had belonged to my grandmother Odessa, passed down to her from her own mother, a woman named Cassie who was born. According to family stories nobody had ever been able to fully verify, sometime in the final years before emancipation reached this part of Georgia. The Bible itself was old even by the time it reached my hands, its leather cover cracked and repaired more than once, its pages the particular soft, worn texture of paper that's been turned by careful hands across more than a century. I want to tell you what that Bible actually contained, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened afterward. Tucked into its opening pages, in the space traditionally reserved for family records, was handwriting spanning 5 generations, births and deaths and marriages recorded in at least 3 different hands over more than 100 years. The earliest entries in a careful, deliberate script that my grandmother always told me belonged to Cassie herself, recording names and dates that existed nowhere else. Not in county records, not in church registries, nowhere except that single. I remember, too, the physical weight of that Bible in my hands as a boy, sitting on my grandmother's lap while she read to me from its worn pages some evenings. Not always scripture, sometimes simply the family record itself, tracing her finger along names of people who died decades before either of us were born, telling me small fragments of their lives she'd heard from her own mother. I didn't understand, as a child, that I was being handed something precious in those evenings, something considerably rarer than the ordinary bedtime stories other children received. I understand it now, looking back, with a clarity that makes the events of this past month sting all the more sharply. My son Marcus is 48, a successful real estate agent here in the county, and he'd been helping me sort through the house over the previous 6 weeks, part of an ongoing conversation about whether it might make sense for me to move into a smaller place now that the stairs and the yard had become more than I could easily manage alone. I want to be fair to Marcus here, because I think it matters for understanding what happened. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was moving fast through a task that felt, to him, straightforward, sorting decades of accumulated belongings into categories of keep, donate, and discard, without stopping to examine closely what any specific item actually represented. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments whether you've ever had something irreplaceable nearly lost because somebody else decided, without asking, that it wasn't worth keeping. I found that Bible sitting on top of the giveaway pile on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days before the scheduled donation pickup, and when I asked Marcus about it, genuinely more confused than upset in that first moment, he barely looked up from the box he was taping shut. "Dad, it's falling apart, and half the pages are just handwriting nobody can even read clearly anymore. Nobody reads those old family Bibles these days anyway." I figured the donation center could sell it or something, or somebody who actually wants an old Bible could pick it up. I want you to sit with that moment the way I had to sit with it, standing in my own living room, looking at a giveaway pile that included the single most complete record of 5 generations of my family's history, a record my own son had decided, in the span of maybe 30 seconds, wasn't worth keeping. Welcome back to Brian's Revenge if you're just joining us. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what happened over the following weeks, starting with a grandson nobody in this family had ever fully credited with much foresight, is the reason that Bible didn't end up exactly where Marcus intended it to end up. My grandson Malik is 24, Marcus's own son, the one member of this family everybody had quietly decided wasn't going to amount to much, having left a community college business program 18 months earlier to work a series of retail and warehouse jobs that never seemed to satisfy his father's sense of what a young man should be building toward. Malik had stopped by that same Saturday afternoon, mostly to help carry boxes, and I remember him pausing at that giveaway pile, picking up the Bible himself, turning it over carefully in his hands the way you handle something you sense matters even before you fully understand why. I want to tell you something about Malik that I didn't fully understand myself until these past several weeks, something that helps explain exactly why he was the one who noticed what his own father had missed entirely. Malik had actually been a genuinely curious child, the kind who used to ask me endless questions about family history during the same evenings I now realize were shaping how he saw the world. Questions his own father, busy building a real estate. He left that business program not because he lacked ability. His professors had actually told his mother at the time that he showed real promise, but because the specific track he'd chosen, pushed heavily by Marcus's own expectations about what constituted a respectable career, never once matched what actually interested him. I remember a conversation with Malik maybe a year before all of this happened, sitting on my porch on an ordinary evening, him telling me, almost apologetically, that he'd always been more interested in how things actually worked, in building and fixing and understanding mechanisms, than in the sales and marketing coursework his business program had emphasized. I told him that evening that there was no shame in wanting something different than what his father had planned for him, though I don't think either of us fully understood, at the time, how thoroughly that gentle porch conversation would end up mattering months later. "Grandpa," he said, quiet, "is this really going in the donation pile?" "That's your father's call," I told him, not quite steady, still working through my own confusion about the whole situation. Malik didn't argue with his father directly, not that afternoon. But I noticed, later that evening after everyone else had gone home, that the giveaway pile by the curb was missing exactly one item. "If you're still with me, that tells me something about you. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss where this one goes. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from." Because what Malik did with that Bible over the following weeks, without telling anyone in this family what he'd actually done, is the reason this story doesn't end where it very nearly did. Malik told me the truth about 3 weeks later, sheepish, worried I might be upset that he'd taken something without asking. He noticed the handwriting inside those opening pages, recognized, in some instinctive way neither of us could fully articulate at the time, that it represented something worth protecting even if he didn't understand exactly what. He'd taken the Bible home to his own apartment, wrapped carefully in a towel, sitting on his bookshelf, safe from a donation truck that would have carried it away to some anonymous second-hand shop shelf, likely never to be seen by this family again. I remember him describing, once he finally admitted what he'd done, exactly how he'd made that decision, standing at the curb that Saturday evening after his father had left, looking at that giveaway pile one more time before the scheduled pickup, and feeling, he told me, a specific discomfort he couldn't fully name. A sense that letting that particular book disappear into an anonymous donation stream would mean losing something none of us could ever properly explain to anyone who asked what exactly had been lost. He'd simply picked it up quietly and walked it to his car, not planning ahead, not thinking through any larger implications, just acting on an instinct he trusted more than he trusted his own ability to explain it. I want you to understand what it meant to me, learning that my grandson, the one everybody else in this family had quietly filed away as somebody who lacked direction, had been the only person paying close enough attention to recognize that a piece of our family's actual history deserved more consideration than 30 seconds of a moving Saturday afternoon. My health had been giving me some trouble that same stretch, an irregular heartbeat that my doctor wanted addressed with a procedure that came with an out-of-pocket cost, my modest retirement income made harder to absorb than I would have liked. I called Marcus about it, mostly out of old habit, and he was sympathetic in the distant, busy way he'd been sympathetic about most things these past several years, offered to help me research payment plans, mentioned he had a big closing coming up that was eating most of his available time and cash flow that particular month. I remember that phone call with a particular clarity, sitting in my own kitchen, listening to my son explain, in the careful, practiced tone he probably uses with clients discussing closing costs, exactly why the timing wasn't ideal for him to help directly. I understood, in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before that call, that Marcus's version of care had become entirely conditional on convenience, a pattern I think had been building for years without either of us ever naming it directly. I called Malik instead, ashamed in a way I hadn't expected, calling my grandson rather than my son, and he cut me off before I'd finished explaining. "Grandpa, stop. How much and by when? Malik, I can't ask you to. You're not." I heard him already moving, papers shuffling on his end of the line. "I've got some savings. It's not much, but it's something. Let me help." He didn't have much, working the modest retail job he was working that year, but he emptied what savings he had, close to $1,100 he'd been setting aside toward a used car he badly needed, and handed it over without a moment's hesitation, the same quiet, unassuming generosity he'd shown carrying that Bible out of a giveaway pile weeks earlier. I remember asking him, once I understood exactly what he'd sacrificed, whether he was certain, whether the car wasn't something he genuinely needed for his own daily life. He told me, in the same steady, unbothered tone he used about most things, that he could keep riding the bus a while longer, that the bus schedule was inconvenient but survivable, that watching me struggle to afford basic medical care wasn't something he was willing to just watch happen from a comfortable distance while his own savings sat untouched in an account. I want you to sit with that math for a moment, the way I had to sit with it. A 24-year-old grandson working a retail job, giving up his only realistic path toward reliable transportation, without a single moment's hesitation, while my own son, financially secure, offered research assistance and a mention of his own busy schedule. That's the difference, if you want it in one sentence before I go any further. Marcus offered what his busy schedule comfortably allowed. Malik offered everything he had the moment it actually mattered. The procedure happened 3 weeks later, funded by Malik's savings and a modest payment plan the clinic arranged for the remainder. And it went well, clean recovery, though I spent the first several days moving slower than I would have liked. Malik came by most evenings during that recovery, checking on me, bringing groceries, sitting with me through the particular boredom of a slow recuperation, never once mentioning what the $1,100 had actually cost him personally. I remember one particular evening during that recovery, Malik arriving straight from a closing shift at the retail store where he worked, still in his uniform polo, carrying a grocery bag with exactly the specific soup I'd mentioned liking a few days earlier, a detail I hadn't expected him to remember, let alone act on. We sat together that evening watching an old Western on my television, and I remember thinking, watching him fall asleep in my armchair partway through, exhausted from a full shift followed immediately by an hour on the bus to reach my house, that I hadn't felt this genuinely cared for by anyone in longer than I wanted to admit, not since my own wife passed some years back. There was another evening, closer to 2 weeks into my recovery, when Malik brought the Bible over on his own initiative, said he'd been reading through the family record pages carefully at his own apartment, genuinely curious about names and dates he'd never had reason to examine closely before. We spent that whole evening going through it together, me telling him whatever fragments of family history I actually knew, him asking careful, patient questions about names neither of us could fully place, both of us leaning over that fragile book with a kind of reverence I don't think either of us had expected to feel that evening. I asked him at some point that evening what had actually made him decide to rescue the Bible from that giveaway pile in the first place, genuinely curious about the instinct that had driven a decision he still couldn't fully articulate months later. He thought about it a long moment before answering. "Grandpa, I think it was the handwriting. Looking at it, I could tell somebody had cared enough to write it carefully, you know, like it mattered to them while they were doing it." It felt wrong letting something like that just disappear into a donation pile where nobody would ever know what it actually was. There was an evening, about a week into my recovery, when I finally asked him directly how he was managing without the car he'd been saving toward. He shrugged it off the way he shrugs off most things people worry about on his behalf. "It's fine, Grandpa. The bus adds maybe 40 minutes to my day. That's nothing compared to what would have happened if you hadn't gotten that procedure in time. If this story's got a knot forming in your stomach already, that's exactly where I need you to be. Because what happened next, from a woman who had no idea our family even existed until 3 weeks ago, is the reason I'm sitting here telling you any of this at all." The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, a woman introducing herself as Dr. Simone Baptiste, a genealogist working with the Colbys Crossing Historical Preservation Society. She explained, her voice carrying an urgency I didn't understand yet, that she'd spent the past 4 years researching the founding families of this town, families who'd settled this specific patch of Georgia in the years immediately following emancipation, families whose names had been systematically erased from most official county records over the following century, preserved, if they survived at all, only in oral history and private family documents like church records and family. I remember Dr. Baptiste explaining, during that first call, the particular difficulty of the research she'd been conducting, walking me through years of work that had involved combing through fragmentary church records, newspaper archives that had mostly ignored black communities entirely during that period, and oral histories collected decades earlier by a previous generation of local historians whose own records had themselves grown fragmentary over time. She told me that the official county history, the version taught in local schools and displayed in the County Historical Museum, credited the founding of Colby's Crossing entirely to a white landowner named Elias Colby, whose name the town itself still carried, with almost no acknowledgement of the formerly enslaved families who'd actually done the work of clearing land, building the first structures, and establishing the community's earliest institutions. "Mr. Ainsworth," she told me, "I've been trying to trace the descendants of a woman named Cassie Whitfield, one of the founding settlers of this community, for the better part of 2 years now. County records from that period are incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. I found a reference to her in an old church ledger that mentioned a daughter named Odessa. Mr. Ainsworth, is there any chance your family has any connection to a woman named Cassie?" I sat there in stunned silence for a long moment, understanding, gradually, exactly what she was asking, and exactly what my own family's history actually represented to a project I hadn't even known existed until that phone call. "Cassie was my great-great-grandmother," I told her. "Odessa was my grandmother. Their names, along with 4 more generations after them, are recorded by hand in a family Bible that's been passed down since the years right after the Civil War." Baptiste's end of that line stretched long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice had gone thick with something I only understood once I met her in person weeks later. "Mr. Ainsworth, do you still have that Bible?" I explained, my own voice not entirely steady, the whole embarrassing shape of what had nearly happened, the donation pile, my son's dismissal of it as something nobody reads anymore, my grandson's quiet rescue 3 weeks earlier that had, as it turned out, saved the single document her 4 years of research had been searching for. Dr. Baptiste was quiet a long moment after I finished explaining. "Mr. Ainsworth," she finally said, her voice unsteady in a way I found genuinely moving, coming from a woman who'd clearly spent years maintaining professional composure through countless dead ends and frustrated searches. I need you to understand what this means. I've spent 4 years trying to prove something the official record has spent a century and a half denying. I was starting to believe I might never find documentary proof strong enough to actually change anything. Your family's Bible might be exactly that proof. If this story's got you leaning forward, that's exactly where you should be, because what that Bible turned out to represent, once Dr. Baptiste finally saw it in person, changed everything about how this town understood its own founding history, and everything about what my own family was about to receive because of it. I called Malik that same evening, asked him to bring the Bible back so Dr. Baptiste could examine it properly, and I remember the particular pride in his voice when I told him what her research had uncovered, understanding, I think, for the first time, exactly what he'd actually protected weeks earlier without fully knowing why it mattered. Dr. Baptiste drove out to my house 2 days later, and I watched her hands actually shake as she turned those fragile pages, reading names and dates in handwriting that had survived more than a century and a half. Ainsworth, she said, her voice unsteady, this confirms everything. Cassie Whitfield wasn't just one of the founding settlers of Colby's Crossing. According to church records I've cross-referenced against your family's Bible, she was the primary organizer, the woman who negotiated the original land purchase from a sympathetic landowner in 1868, who recruited the other 11 founding families, who essentially built this community from nothing in the years immediately after emancipation. Her name has been almost entirely erased from official county history, replaced in most surviving records by white landowners who claimed credit for the settlement decades later. Your family's Bible is the only surviving primary source document that proves her actual role. I asked Dr. Baptiste, my voice unsteady with the weight of what I was learning, to explain more fully what she meant about the official record erasing Cassie's contribution, genuinely wanting to understand the full scope of what her research had uncovered. She walked me through it patiently, explaining that the town's official founding narrative, taught for generations in local schools and displayed prominently in the county historical museum, credited Elias Colby, the white landowner whose name the town still carried, with single-handedly establishing the settlement as a charitable gesture toward formerly enslaved families in the area. That narrative, she explained, had been constructed decades after the actual founding, during a period when local historical societies across the South were actively rewriting Reconstruction-era history to minimize Black agency and achievement, replacing complicated, difficult truths with simpler, more comfortable stories that centered white benevolence rather than Black self-determination. The actual historical record, once you dug deep enough to find it, she told me, told a very different story. Cassie Whitfield had approached Elias Colby directly, not as a supplicant seeking charity, but as a shrewd negotiator who understood exactly what she was asking for and why the arrangement would benefit both parties. She'd organized 11 other families, coordinated the pooling of what little resources any of them had managed to accumulate in the chaotic years immediately following emancipation, and personally oversaw the earliest construction efforts that established the town's original core, including the church whose ledgers had first put Dr. Baptiste on the trail toward finding my family at all. I want you to understand what it felt like, sitting in my own living room, learning that a woman whose name I'd heard my whole life only as a distant, half-mythical ancestor had actually been the driving force behind an entire town's founding, her contribution systematically written out of the official record for a century and a half, preserved only because my grandmother and her mother before her had carefully protected a single fragile book through generations of moves, fires, and every other ordinary hazard that destroys most family documents eventually. That's the moment something in me went quiet and cold and very, very clear. Dr. Baptiste explained over the following weeks exactly what this discovery meant beyond its historical significance alone. The Colbys Crossing Historical Preservation Society had been administering, for over 2 decades, a scholarship trust established by a local philanthropic foundation, specifically for verified descendants of the town's founding families, a fund that had sat largely unclaimed for years because so few families could provide documentary proof of their lineage sufficient to satisfy the trust's verification requirements. My family's Bible, once authenticated by the Society's historians, provided exactly that proof, not just for myself, but for every one of Cassie Whitfield's documented descendants going forward. I asked Dr. Baptiste, during one of our later conversations, why so few families had been able to provide adequate documentation over the Trust's 20-year existence, genuinely curious about the broader scope of what her research had revealed. She explained that the same historical erasure that had stripped Cassie Whitfield's name from the official record had affected most of the town's founding families equally, their own documentation scattered or lost across generations of displacement, poverty, and the ordinary hazards of preserving fragile paper records, without the resources wealthier families might have used to protect them properly. My family's Bible had survived, she told me, largely because my grandmother Odessa had made its protection a lifelong, almost sacred priority, understanding, in a way the rest of us were only now beginning to fully grasp, exactly what that book actually represented. Mr. Ainsworth, Dr. Baptiste told me, during our final meeting before the Society's formal announcement, the Trust's current balance, after 2 decades of unclaimed growth, sits at just over $400,000, designated specifically for educational support for Cassie Whitfield's verified descendants. Your family Bible didn't just correct the historical record. It unlocked educational funding that's been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for over 20. I sat with that number a long while, thinking about a giveaway pile, about 30 seconds of a busy Saturday afternoon, about a grandson who'd quietly rescued something nobody else in this family had thought worth a second glance. I didn't call Marcus right away. I want you to remember that because it matters for what comes later. I called Dr. Baptiste's office instead, asked how the fund's disbursement process actually worked, whether it could be directed toward a specific descendant's education rather than distributed evenly across every verified family member. She explained that each verified descendant could apply individually, but that nothing prevented one descendant from directing their own portion or encouraging the Society to prioritize a specific family member's application, particularly given the unusual circumstances of how the documentation had actually been preserved and rescued. I want the fund to know exactly how this Bible survived to reach your research team, I told her. Not through my careful stewardship. Through my grandson Malik's decision to quietly take it out of a donation pile. His own father had put it in without being asked, without anyone else in this family even knowing what he'd done until weeks later. Dr. Baptiste was quiet a moment. Mr. Ainsworth, I think the Society would be very moved to hear that story directly from Malik himself, if he's willing to share it. I suspect it might carry real weight in how his own application gets considered. Malik's scholarship application, once he submitted it with Dr. Baptiste's full documentation and the story of how he'd rescued the Bible, was approved within 3 weeks, a 4-year award covering full tuition at the State University's engineering program he'd quietly been hoping to eventually pursue, a dream he'd never once mentioned to his own father, uncertain, I think, that it would be taken seriously given how the family had already quietly filed him away as somebody without much direction. If you've stuck with this story all the way through, That tells me something about the kind of person you are. And I think you're going to want to see how Marcus responds when he finally understands what actually happened, because he doesn't find out from me sitting him down formally. He finds out the way families usually find out important things, gradually, through a conversation none of us had fully planned to have. Marcus came by about 2 weeks after the Historical Preservation Society's public announcement, having heard from a neighbor that something significant had happened involving our family and the old church records downtown. Some connection he couldn't quite piece together from the fragments he'd heard secondhand. He found me at my kitchen table with Dr. Baptiste's official documentation spread out in front of me, the same table where, weeks earlier, I'd first learned my own son had nearly given away the single most important object our family had ever possessed. "Dad, what is all this?" he asked, and I watched his face as he slowly read through the documentation, piecing together, sentence by sentence, exactly what he'd nearly thrown away on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. "Dad," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd heard from my adult son in years, "this is the Bible, isn't it? The one I put in the donation pile." "It is," I told him, steady but not unkind. "And I want you to understand, Marcus, I don't think you did it out of anything except carelessness, moving too fast through a task that felt straightforward to you. But I also want you to understand what that carelessness nearly cost this entire town's history and what it took to make sure." He sat down slowly across from me, and I watched him read through the details of Malik's rescue, the quiet decision to take the Bible home without telling anyone, the scholarship application, the full 4-year engineering award now sitting on the table alongside everything else. "Malik did all this?" he asked, something complicated crossing his face, part genuine pride in his son, part something else I think was closer to shame at how thoroughly this family had underestimated. "He did," I said, every bit of it quietly without being asked twice, and without ever once expecting credit for it. Marcus was quiet a long moment, turning one of the printed documents over in his hands, and when he spoke again his voice carried something rawer than I usually heard from him. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I don't think I've ever actually said it out loud before. I've spent 18 months feeling embarrassed about Malik leaving that business program. I told myself it was because he wasn't willing to work hard enough, because it was easier to believe that than to actually sit down and ask him what he actually wanted for his own life. I think I've been pushing him toward a version of success that looks like mine, Dad, without ever once asking whether it's actually the life he wants to build. I want you to hear something, Marcus," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Your son just spent weeks quietly protecting a piece of this family's history because he recognized something worth saving that you walked right past. That's not a young man who lacks direction. That's a young man who's been quietly waiting for somebody in this family to actually pay attention to what he notices and what he cares about." He put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked back up there were tears he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "I don't know how to fix 18 months of not really seeing him clearly, Dad, in one conversation." "You don't have to fix it in one conversation," I told him. "You just have to start. He's probably sitting at home right now, still assuming this whole family sees him the same way it did last month. That's the thing that actually needs fixing first." He left my house that evening and drove straight to Malik's apartment. I found out later, sat with him for hours, the two of them talking more honestly than they had in years about what Malik actually wanted from his own life, about the engineering interests he'd never felt safe admitting to his own father, about the particular loneliness of feeling quietly written off by the people who were supposed to know you best. I want you to sit with that outcome the way I've sat with it these past several weeks, understanding that a giveaway pile sitting at a curb for 30 ordinary seconds ended up doing something none of us could have predicted, forcing this entire family to finally look clearly at a young man we'd all, in our own separate ways, decided wasn't worth looking closely at. I've thought a great deal in the weeks since all of this happened about what it actually means to notice somebody's value, really notice it, instead of letting an easier, less complicated story settle into place about who they are and what they're capable of. Malik had been carrying real insight and real care. This entire family failed to see for 18 months, not because he'd hidden it deliberately, but because none of us had bothered to ask the right questions. Content instead with the comfortable, undemanding story of a grandson who simply hadn't found direction yet. I think about my grandmother Odessa too, more than I expected to during these past weeks, dusting that Bible's cover every single week for decades, protecting a record the rest of the world had decided wasn't worth preserving, understanding, in a way none of the rest of us fully grasped until Dr. Baptiste's phone call, exactly how much weight those handwritten pages actually carried. I think there's a lesson in that, about the particular gift of paying close, patient attention to things other people have decided are disposable, and about how rare that kind of attention actually is, even within families that love each other as completely as this one does. What I know for certain is this: the people who notice what's actually worth saving aren't always the ones you'd expect based on how the family has always talked about them. Sometimes the person doing the truest protecting is the one everybody else quietly decided, without ever properly asking, wasn't paying close enough attention to anything at all. That's where I'm going to leave this for now. Because what I told Marcus next, sitting at that same kitchen table where a giveaway pile had nearly erased a century and a half of our family's actual history in 30 ordinary seconds, is a conversation that changes everything about how this family understands which one of us actually pays attention when something truly irreplaceable is sitting right in front of us. Stay with me. Part 2 picks up exactly where this one stops, right there at that kitchen table, and it does not go the way Marcus walked in expecting.